We have been examining market structures, and what we have done is we have looked at perfect competition as a first example, and then we looked at monopoly as a second example of market structure. Now what we do is we look at a third market structure called monopolistic competition, and as the name implies, it has an element of monopoly and an element of competition, and thus monopolistic competition. Once again, monopolistic competition is an example of imperfect competition, and we know imperfect competition arises as long as there is some departure from perfect competition. So let us revisit the assumptions we made under perfect competition. The first assumption we made is rationality and perfect knowledge. The second assumption we made is very large number of very small sellers. The third assumption we made under perfect competition is different sellers sell homogeneous product, or in other words, they sell exactly identical products, so that consumers cannot differentiate the product sold by the first seller from the product sold by the second seller under perfect competition. And then the last assumption we made is of free entry, free exit, and this has long run consequences. Let us now assume that the first assumption we made of rationality and perfect knowledge under perfect competition is valid under different market structures. So let us look at the violations of assumptions 2, 3 and 4 under perfect competition. And let us start with the second assumption. The second assumption is the market has very large number of very small sellers, and under imperfect competition we will have less than very large number of very small sellers. Now, when we have very large number of very small sellers, you might remember from perfect competition that different sellers are price takers. So when we have perfect competition, different sellers are price takers. Under imperfect competitions, the sellers are no longer price takers, or in other words, they have some control over the market or the price, and we know how it works. They can sell more at a lower price and less at a higher price, or in other words, under imperfect competition, different sellers face a downward sloping demand curve. And so we are looking at dropping the assumption of very large number of very small sellers. We have already examined monopoly, where we just have one seller, and this entire one seller captures the entire market for this product. Under monopolistic competition, we have the number of sellers is less than what we would have under perfect competition, but greater than what we would have under monopoly, which is one seller, and this would give rise to each seller facing a downward sloping demand curve. Now, oligopoly is an in-between situation between monopoly and monopolistic competition. In oligopoly, what we have is very few sellers. There are so few sellers that you can count them on your fingers. For example, if you look at the number of producers of large commercial aircrafts, there are just 2 or 3, Boeing, Airbus, and the Russian Illusion. And so you can count them on your fingers. And so when we drop the second assumption, each seller, this is the consequence in terms of the diagram, and that is each seller will face a downward sloping demand. Now this is a diagram which applies to sellers facing a downward sloping demand curve. We already know demand curve is the same thing as average revenue curve. And since average revenue curve is downward sloping, or in other words, the seller can sell more at a higher price and less at a lower price, when we have a downward sloping average revenue curve, the marginal revenue curve will lie below the demand curve or the average revenue curve. So this is a diagram that you will see under different market structures of imperfect competition. Now let us revisit the third assumption we have made under perfect competition, and that is what kind of product is sold by different sellers. And what we have assumed is different sellers sell identical products, or what we are looking at is a market where we have homogeneous products. Now under perfect competition, since different sellers are selling identical products or homogeneous products, that simply means the output of different sellers, they are just perfect substitutes. The consumers cannot distinguish between output sold by one seller from that of output sold by the second seller, and hence the output sold by different sellers under perfect competition are perfect substitutes of one another. The second market structure we examined is that of monopoly, and we have only one seller. And what this means is, since we have one seller in the market, no one else produces what a monopolist produces, or in other words, there are no substitutes for the product sold by the monopolist. Now, under monopolistic competition and oligopoly, we have a choice, and it all depends on the real world situation. Either different sellers could be selling identical products, or they could be selling what we call differentiated products. And what this means is, is that different sellers are selling products which are similar but not exactly the same, or in other words, they are imperfect substitutes. I'll just write imperfect substitutes. Now consider a market, say for toothpaste. There are different companies which produce and sell toothpaste like Crest, Mentadent, Colgate, and so on. Now what these companies do is they spend a lot of money on advertising and packaging, and one of the purposes of this is to differentiate their product from rest of the competitors, say in the toothpaste market. We know there's Crest and there's Colgate, just as an example, and Colgate and Crest serve exactly the same purpose. They're used for cleaning our teeth, but then in our minds what we believe is Crest is somewhat different from Colgate. And so what these different sellers do is they try to create a brand loyalty. And why would they create a brand loyalty? Simply to increase their market share. And so they spend a lot of money on advertising and packaging differently, and they will try to convince consumers that, for example, Crest will clean your teeth whiter relative to Colgate, and Colgate will tell you the same thing. So under monopolistic competition, it's entirely possible that different sellers may sell exactly identical products, or they may sell differentiated products. And once again, when you're looking at differentiated products, different sellers are selling imperfect substitutes of one another. For example, Honda Accord is similar to Toyota Camry, but not exactly the same, particularly in the eyes of the consumer. So this is what the third assumption, if we violate this, this is what may happen. As far as we are concerned, for monopolistic competition, we could either use identical products or differentiated products in our analysis. Let us revisit the fourth assumption we made under perfect competition, and that is of free entry, free exit. You'll recall that this simply means that it's easy for any firm to start or quit business, and it is costless for any firm to start or quit business. And costless simply means it could be in legal terms or financial terms. Now, under perfect competition, what you are looking at are very small businesses, and there it makes sense to have this assumption, and that is anyone can get into this business or anyone can quit this business. And the consequence of this assumption is in the long run, and that is in the long run, a firm under perfect competition will be under no profit, no loss, or in other words, price will equal long run average cost, and this will ensure that the firm is neither earning profits nor incurring losses. Under monopoly, if a monopolist stays a monopolist in the long run, this assumption of free entry, free exit is not valid, either because of natural advantages or because the firm erects or the monopolist erects its own barriers to entry or exit. No other competitor can enter the market, and thus under monopoly in the long run, if a monopolist stays a monopolist in the long run, the monopolist can earn profits or incur losses in the long run. As far as monopolistic competition goes, we still want to keep the threat of new entrants or even existing firms quitting the business. So under monopolistic competition as well as under oligopoly, we'll still continue to assume the assumption of free entry, free exit. And so under monopolistic competition, the firm under monopolistic competition will make no profits or incur no losses, or what we require is price will equal long run average cost. Though it is entirely possible that firms under monopolistic competition, there might be some barriers to entry or for exit, but to keep life simple for ourselves, we'll still assume free entry, free exit. What we have examined so far is the violation of assumptions under perfect competition, and when these assumptions, any one or all of them are violated, what we get is imperfect competition. And monopolistic competition, and oligopoly are all examples of imperfect competition. And this is a summary table of assumptions we make under different market structure. And this completes our introduction of monopolistic competition. In the next lecture video, we'll examine equilibrium under monopolistic competition. Thank you for your time.